Chapter 14. Not even 30 seconds after Nicholas had disappeared, he reappeared in front of Gustavo and Dan. They looked up at the messenger standing before them, shook their heads and smiled. "All right, gentlemen," Nicholas said, resuming his seat on the sofa. "If I now have convinced you that I can help you elucidate this unfortunate interlude in your life, Mr. Politano, I am ready to answer your questions." "Okay, Nicholas, I'll play." "No, Mr. Politano, this is not a game. Far from it, in fact. But go ahead. Don't let me interrupt you." "Yes, of course," Dan went on. "I guess my first question would be, how did I happen to land in that clearing? Or is that something you're unable to tell me?" No, it's not a problem. I will tell you what I know. But let me start by saying that what happened to you is not common. Usually when people travel to their past, they have a purpose in life. You see, most of us have some reason for revisiting an event we wish to change or enjoy once more before we pass on. In your case, your landing here in 1988 was an accident. However, it is also an indication that you have always had a secret desire, shall we say, to be here." "You mean I wished to be in Key West?" Dan asked. "Precisely. You see, as soon as you walked out of the hospital, you went to the naval facilities. Do you know why you did this?" Dan shook his head. "Not really, no. I felt, if that's the word, drawn to see the aircraft carrier. I didn't know why, but that's the first place I wanted to visit." "Ah, yes, exactly what I thought. You felt drawn to something that was niggling at your subconscious, didn't you?" "I suppose so, and it's only when Gustavo drew my attention to the possibility of me being an officer in the Navy that I discovered I was, in fact, enrolled to take the training on the 10th of this month." Good. I'm glad to hear that you found out what that secret desire was and that you do know why you fell in this place." "Yes, but that doesn't tell me how I happened to fall, does it?" "Not yet, Mr. Politano, not yet. Have a little patience. All will become clear very soon." "I'm sorry to interrupt," Gustavo put in, "but could you tell us what sort of messenger you are, Nicholas?" He paused for a fraction of a second. "Because, you see, when I was in the Middle East, I saw a person like you, but at the same time I thought I was suffering from battle fatigue and put the whole thing down to hallucination." Nicholas's chortle interrupted Dan's query. "It was probably not a hallucination, Gustavo, but another messenger like me endeavouring to guide you home in one piece, shall we say." Putting his elbows on his knees and looking down at his feet, Gustavo added, "Yes, and I think maybe I should have listened to my messenger, and maybe I wouldn't have done the things I've done since I've come back." The ruefulness in Gustavo's voice was blatant. "Perhaps it was, Gustavo, but I have heard you make a promise to Dan here which should see you out of the woods pretty soon, I suspect." "Thank you for that, Nicholas," Gustavo said, leaning against the back of the chair once again and stretching his arms above his head and then locking his fingers at the nape of his neck. Nicholas then returned his attention to Dan. "Mr. Politano, I know that you're anxious to know how all this happened, so now that we know why you landed here, I think you need to ask yourself where you were minutes before your unfortunate fall. Do you remember?" "No, I have no idea what I was doing. I only remember being in a clearing very similar to the one in the park and Damien standing a few feet from me. Besides which, the only thing that I recall was a log cabin at the edge of the clearing. But that's all." "Very good," Nicholas said, placing both hands on the top of his cane. "Now let me add something to that recollection, and the reason for which you should not be here." Dan returned to his staring at the messenger. "As far as I can gather, you were about to return to your future, after an extensive and successful trip into your past when you missed to abide by one of the rules that would have brought you back safely." "Which rule was that?" Dan asked anxiously. "You forgot to hold hands with your wife." Dan was flabbergasted. He didn't know if he should jump for joy or cry his heart out. You mean you're saying I'm married?" He got up from his seat and began pacing the length of the living room under Nicholas's gaze. "But why wouldn't I have observed such a simple rule? Was I unable to hold my wife's hand?" He stopped and turned to face Nicholas. "And what's the lady's name?" "Malou is her name, and you forgot, or shall we say omitted to hold her hand because your arm was in a sling." "My arm was in a sling, you say? Did I have another accident? Was I riding my bike or something?" Nicholas shook his head vigorously this time and put up a hand. "No, Mr. Politano, you were not riding a bike, you were skiing." "That's it!" Dan shouted, rounding his seat to look at Gustavo. "Didn't I tell you about me falling against the trunk of a tree? Didn't I?" "You sure did," Gustavo agreed. "And that's when I told you that you must have dreamt it because there was no snow anywhere in Florida." "Exactly." Dan turned to Nicholas once again. "And you're saying this accident happened in my future? I mean a future from today?" "Yes, Mr. Politano, and unfortunately therein lays the problem." "How do you mean?" Dan questioned. "Simply because people can travel in their past or visit it, if you like, given the opportunity, but no one is able to visit their future." "And that means I can't go back or forward, I should say, to regain my future, is that right?" "Absolutely. You see, the only possibility for you to return to your future is for your wife to find you. But can't you just go to her and tell her where I am? Dan rushed to ask. No, Mr. Politano, only Damianos is able to travel with her and your children. I have children too? How amazing is that? Yes, they are going to try to find you, since I am not able to travel in the future either. I were only able to relay messages, such as I did now, giving you an update on their progress. But if you did that, Gustavo asked, why can't you talk to Damianos, and ask him to come where you are today? Because I am not supposed to talk to Damianos, and even if I could, I wouldn't. But how were you made aware of all the things that you told us about just now? Please understand me, Mr. Politano. I am only transmitting the messages I receive from God. More than that I don't know. I suggest the phrase means that you should not venture in the high seas, Damianos replied to Gabby's question, having regained some seriousness in his voice. However, there is a key to find on this continent. But is that a key an object, or is it the name of a place? Stefano asked. Because as Damien pointed out before we left the old house, the first sentence is an indication of the location where my father fell, isn't it? Absolutely, Damianos said. And you are correctly gathered. The key in question is to be located somewhere at a specific cardinal point. But what are we supposed to do on this beach? Milou asked, looking up to the houses skirting the ocean shore. Just ask yourselves the questions that need to be asked, Milou. The answers will guide you farther into your search. Yes, Mum. That's what Damien and Solangi said. These two phrases are a starting point. And that means we need to find out where we are and go on from there, is that it? Yes, and without being tempted to err on the ocean swell, Daniel added musingly. Okay then, if that's what we need to do, let's go to the town behind us and see where we are, Milou concluded, already walking toward the path that would lead them away from the beach and to the city beyond. As they arrived to the top of the embankment and stepped onto the esplanade that seemed to stretch far into the distance, Daniel remarked, looking all around him, There's no one around here. There's no car, no one walking. Did you notice that? He looked at his mother inquisitively. Maybe it's too early. She turned her gaze to Damianos. What time is it? Whatever time you wish it to be, Milou. Remember, time is of no importance while you're travelling to your destination. But it's a bit strange, you must admit, Milou countered. Every place we've ever visited together on our previous journey, there was always a time reference, wasn't there? Ah, yes, you're right. However, the previous journey was not dedicated to travelling through time. It was designed to have your husband recall events or visit places that his ancestry had either left or where they had lived. Okay, Damianos, but where do we go from here? Gabby asked, looking down at the notepad again. Think of your cardinal points. If the beach to your left was east, and the esplanade runs north-south, so you can choose to go north towards northeastern states, or you can choose to go south. And if we crossed the street, we'd go west, right? Daniel interposed. Absolutely, Damianos agreed. However, if you are to read the second sentence again, it asks you not to lose yourselves in the swells of the ocean, which may indicate that you should stay close to the coast. Geez, this is worse than the old maths problems, Gabby said, shaking her head. Why don't we go south then, Mum? Daniel suggested. Why would you say that? Milou asked. Because, Mum, Stefano said, we've just left Pennsylvania, and if there was any reason to believe that Dad had landed north of his initial point of departure, then we wouldn't have landed back in Florida, would we? And how do you know this is the Florida coast? Gabby demanded. It could be any coastal town of Pennsylvania, couldn't it? How about this? Stefano pointed to a road sign across the street. Would that be enough to convince you we're in Florida? Good Lord, you're right, Milou exclaimed, gazing at the sign which displayed the Florida state emblem. She looked at each of her children in turn. So do we all agree to go south from here? They nodded in unison and began walking along the esplanade. The morning freshness seemed to have opened their eyes to other indications to time and places, for Gabby remarked, You know, Mum, it shouldn't be any later than 7 or 8 in the morning. Why do you think that? Daniel pointed to the sun. It was perhaps an hour above the eastern horizon. Look, Mum, the sun is not high enough to be later than that. Well, Milou replied, shading her eyes against the light and looking toward the beach, I guess you're right. The farther they walked, the more people and their vehicles began to appear. It was as if the city had just woken up to the fact there was another day to be lived and enjoyed under the Florida sunshine.